Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time we are going to be building another editor extension, and this one is going to be focused on the terrain side of things. So we're going to set up some stuff to make it a little bit easier to import heightmap images and also to export ones, and it's going to give us a bit of a framework that we could then be using to add and extend later on. So let's dive on in. So to begin with, I have set up a Unity terrain with a very rough initial sort of setup there in terms of its appearance. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up our editor extension. So this is going to be a custom editor window. So the idea being that similar to things like the inspector, that it will be something that we can just bring up and be able to actually be operating with the terrains. So this needs to go into our editor folder, and I'm going to call this our terrain helper editor window. Just get that created. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of initial things, just some boilerplate stuff that we have to do with the fact that this is an editor window. So one of the first things we're going to be doing, because we want access to any of the editor stuff, is we're going to bring in Unity Editor. And this is going to be based off of editor window. So then what I want to do is just a couple of initial things so that we're able to actually show the window. So what we need to do is I'm going to set up a public static function that I'm going to just call show window. Now I want to set up the menu item for that, so I can add in a menu item. And I'm going to put this under tools and terrain helper. Then what we need to do is we need to retrieve the window. This will create it if it needs to. So we have our window, and we can just say editor window, get window, and our type goes there. And then I just want to make sure that the title is set correctly. So it's a new GUI content, and I'm just going to label this as terrain helper. And although I won't be drawing anything much yet, what I'm going to do is set up the onGUI function. Now we could also be doing this using the new UI toolkit. That's something that I do intend to dive into the UI toolkit at some point. In particular for the editor side of things, it's really handy for actually working with that. But for now I want something that is going to work in a really wide range of Unity versions. So I'm going to stick with the onGUI setup using the older version of the UI. So all I'm going to do initially is, if we're playing, I don't want to be able to be working with the terrains. So I'm just going to check if application is playing. So if it is playing, then all I want to do is I will exit, and I'm just going to draw a label, and all it's going to say is not available while playing. Just so we've got that little bit of feedback there. Technically, we can modify stuff like of the terrains when we're playing, but it gets a little bit messy in terms of what stuff is going to persist. So just to avoid issues, good to have that set up there where it's not going to allow it to run. So we can see, now we've got under tools, we can go terrain helper. That'll bring up our window, which I'm going to just dock it down here. And what I should notice is when I'm playing, not available when I'm playing, which is good. So now I can start to get this set up for being able to actually select our terrain. That's the starting point. We need to know what terrain we've got selected. And then we want to be able to start doing things with that once we've got it selected. So a lot of our setup here is actually going to be UI related. And a lot of it is going to be, okay, have we got this particular bit of information? If we do, show this set of UI. So we want to have the UI only show things that we can currently work with and that are going to be useful at that particular point in time. So first thing, I want to be able to select the terrain. So what I can do is I can set up here a editor GUI layout, and I can create an object field, and then I can have this be called selected terrain, and then I need to give it the currently selected terrain. So what I'm going to do up here is just create, I'm going to specifically mark it as private. I'm going to have terrain, selected terrain. So then what I can do is provide selected terrain here, not seek origin. So selected terrain. I can give it, I want to have it so it only is able to select actual terrain types. So I can provide terrain as a filter there. And I want it to be able to select objects in the scene. So I can say true. Now that, with how the editor side of things works, is I would actually then store that back into selected terrain. Now it's going to give me an error at this point because what it's providing back is something that's just a Unity engine object, because this is designed to work with a wide variety of things. All I actually need to do here is cast that back to a terrain. So with that cast back to a terrain, I should now be able to select a terrain. And what I should find is this, when I go to actually pick something, is showing me things in the scene. And it's only showing me things that actually have that terrain component on it, because I provided that type of information there. So that's good. We've got the terrain selector now. So what I can now do is I can start to actually display bits of UI depending upon that terrain being selected, or that selected terrain being present. So there's two ways that I could write this code. One would be if the selected terrain is not equal to null, and then have my logic here. But if the selected terrain is null, there's not really actually anything that I want to do. And I'm unnecessarily nesting the code there. So how I would generally write this is if the selected terrain is null, we just return. There's nothing further that we want to actually do. So here, draw the terrain selector, and we're earlying out if nothing has been selected. So this will just keep our code a little bit cleaner down here. So now what I could do is I can start to think about the kinds of things that I want to actually draw. First thing, I'm going to actually draw a bit of a label here. So I'm going to actually do a label, and what I'm going to do is this is firstly our Heightmap tools. That bold. So you have these editor styles, and we have bold label. Can be really handy. So I'm going to have a set of Heightmap tools that get drawn. So I'm actually going to put that into its own separate function. The reason I'm prefixing it with onGUI is because it is very much part of that. And so I want to make sure that it's clear sort of the purpose of what it's doing. So the reason I'm doing it down here like that is in case we add in further tools, which it's quite likely that there'd be additional ones we add in. So for now, we're saying Heightmap tools. So one of the things we want to actually do is be able to support importing a Heightmap. So with the Heightmap tools, think the first one we're going to do is our actual importer. So what I'm going to have is, so we have these fold out header groups. So what I'm going to do is, with this we've got a couple of different versions for it, but I'm going to say this will be our importing for being able to bring an image in and use it as the height map. So height map will import expanded. So we need to keep track of if that import option is expanded. So import height map. And then we will also have an editor GUI layout end of that. Now with this, we need to keep track of that. And I'm going to default that to being expanded. So what that will look like, if we go back to the editor, just so we can see what we get with that. So we have import height map. That keeps track of whether it's expanded or not. So that's good. So first thing we need to do if we're wanting to be importing this is we need to be able to select a file. So, okay, I'm going to have a GUI layout button, select height map image. And if that has been selected, well, we want to actually keep track of the file that it has been selected there as part of that. So what we would do is we want to show firstly a file selection dialog. So I can do that. There is actually something built in. So I can go editor utility, and I can go open file panel with filters. So when it says filters, that's meaning being able to control things like the different extensions that are actually shown as available for importing the particular file. So firstly, we give it a name. I'm going to say that it uses the current data path for the actual project. So that will default to the assets folder when we're running in the editor. And then I need to give it the filters, which the way the filters look is we create an array of strings. And then what we do is that would look, firstly we give it a name, so image files, and then we give it the extension. So that allows us to actually indicate, and we don't have the dot, so we would say PNG, JPG, and JPEG for the main ones. We can then also provide here all files, just in case there's something where they want to select something with any extension. So just do an asterisk. So that will allow it to display that dialog. And what will happen is it actually returns the file path. So again, I'm going to set up the variable here, heightmap tool, selected image file path. So I would set that like that. So that's looking good. We've got our setup for it actually displaying the file open dialog, for it checking that file path. I want to check if that's actually valid, because that file path will come back as either a valid location, or it could be something where it's just going to be null or empty. So I'm going to create another bool here, heightmap tool, and selected image path valid, which will default to false. So what I will do is check if that file path exists, which what I can do is go system IO file, and check that that path exists. Like that. So this should allow me to select the image, and then what I can do is, if I've got a valid path, actually provide some additional info. So if that's valid, then let's display some information here. So one thing I could do is, from that file, I could actually get the file name. So if I use path, I can go get file name and give it that. So let's display that bit of information. So have an editor, GUI, layout. I'm going to grab that. A label field, and we can go for selected file, and we'll just output that. So it gives us the actual file name being shown there, just so we know what's been selected. Otherwise, we can do a similar thing. GUI layout, label field, no file selected. Just for providing useful feedback there to the user. So now, it should initially say no file selected. I select the Heightmap image, and I've already brought in an image that I can use for this. So when I select that, it displays selected file. So it's good. We've got information we can now start to be working with for this. So, okay, let's go a little bit further, and let's actually load that image. Because if I load that image, then I can display information like its size, stuff like that. I can check that it's actually valid. Because for importing it as a height map, it needs to be a square image. And depending upon what we're wanting to do with it, it might need to be a very specific size. So displaying that size information and doing some basic checks is really handy. So I'm going to create a texture 2D. This is our Heightmap tool. And this is our selected image. So to actually load the image, well, that's something where when we go and select a new image, we might want to actually do the loading at that point. So what I'm going to do is I need to keep track of if it was previously, if we did previously have an image, and if that image has changed, things like that. So what I would do is here, previous image file path, that's that. And then F, previous image file path, is not equal to this one. And we may need to load it, but we also need to check if it's actually valid. So if it's valid, then we should be doing these checks. If it is not valid, then I'm going to actually clear that texture. So what I'm going to do is, if it's not valid, that gets set to null. And then here, if the image has changed, then I want to actually load it, which it's fairly easy for doing the loading of the image. What I would do is I can say Heightmap load image, and I can go system IO file read all bytes, and we just give it the file path. That will allow it to do the conversion. Now, if this is null, that would actually fail. So we're checking, has the image changed? So if we have no previous image, create a temporary one. So what I would do is, if that selected image is null, we just create a temporary one, and this temporary one can be any size, because what will happen is this load image will replace it. So we don't need to go and make sure it matches sizes, anything like of that. It can just be a throwaway image there. So that's good. We've run through the stuff we should be able to now here assume that if this is valid, that we actually have our selected image present. So what I can do is display a little bit more info. So label field, width, and we'll be able to then also display the height. So what I would do for outputting those is quite straightforward. We do the image width, and we do the same with the height. So now, if I go back here to the editor, now we might need to clear things because it won't have actually properly set things up. So I'm going to reselect this. Now we'll just see where we're getting the errors from. So we can see the selected image isn't valid. And that's to be expected because with how we've been adding the code, we kind of created a situation where it's able to be in a state that it couldn't normally otherwise be in. So I can bring up the terrain helper again, so essentially destroying that window. Select the terrain. We'll select our height map. And now we can see the width and the height. So that error was just because of the order in which we were building stuff. It was possible to get it into a bad state. But now we can see, okay, we've got our width and height. So this is pretty good. We can start to then set up things for doing the actual importing. So we've got a couple of options with the importing. One option is we take the image and we make it match the terrain. So we resize or adjust the image or resample it if need be to match the size that the terrain's height map is. The other option is we change the terrain's height map to match our size. So good to provide both options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up so we have an enum, and I'm going to put that, I think here is an appropriate, actually I'll keep my convention and I'll put the enum up there. So we'll have an enum, and this is going to be a height map import mode. So one mode is fit image to terrain. The other is resize terrain to image. So I might actually change that to height map, or terrain height map. Resize terrain height map. So we've got those two options of how we actually do the importing. So again, I'm going to bring this down here. And that's going to be RE height map. Let's put the name of it, that would be why. So I'm going to then set this up down here. So height map tool, import mode, and I'm going to default it to fitting the image to the height map. The reason being is that's one that is not going, it's going to make less changes to the terrain. It's not going to override settings the user has, and I think good to default to something that's going to be a little bit less invasive there with the option wires. So, okay, I can display the options for doing that. So I know the image path is valid. The other thing I could do here as a check is if the width and the height are the same. So if width is not equal to the height, then we actually have a problem. Because then it's not going to be able to, we could resample it, but in terms of it being usable, it's not really going to be a great option there for it. So what I will do is add a GUI layout, label field, image must be editor styles, and we'll mark that as a bold label. Now in that case, there is nothing further that we can be doing. And we actually, what I'm going to do is end the fold out and return at that point. So image, if it's not square, we can't do anything useful with it. We could easily resample it, but that's something where I don't think is good to do because the terrain is expecting it to be square. If we provide something that isn't square and still make it work, then we're kind of providing a mismatch there, I think, in expectations. Image is not square. So now I can actually check that import mode. So the import mode, in this case, we're using an enum field. So we have Heightmap import mode, edit a GUI layout, and we do an enum pop-up. There's a few different enum ones. It's the enum pop-up one is the one that we want. So we have our import mode, and we have that. So that's good. We've got our import mode. Could be a couple of other useful things. One of the things that could be useful to have is just a generic scale setting. So I'm going to have Heightmap tool, scale. Maybe intensity might be a better term. Intensity. We'll default that to 1. And then I'm just going to have it that we display a slider here as well. Because I think that will be useful. So we're going to have an editor GUI layout, slider, and we give it the current value, 0 and 1. Just have this as intensity. So we're pretty much ready to actually set up our import function. We've got our selection for the import mode, we've got our selection for the intensity. So what I would do is then have another button, GUI layout, button, import Heightmap. And then I'm going to split this out into a separate function because this function is getting quite lengthy. I want to avoid it getting too over the top. So what I would do is, let's say we'll have a function import Heightmap. Now, although we've got all of the variables there and we could just access them, I still tend to go and set these up where I provide the parameters. And the reason for that is it just makes it easier if I want to reuse that function elsewhere. It makes it a little bit more generic. So I'm going to provide the image. I'm going to provide the import mode and the intensity. And also our terrain that's been selected. So what we have is our import Heightmap. We have our terrain. We have our texture 2D for the Heightmap. We have our import mode. And we have our intensity. So we've got a couple of approaches, a couple of ways for how we need to go about doing this importing. So the easiest option is if we are going and actually just replacing it was resizing the terrain. So if our import mode is to resize the terrain, then what we're going to do is a couple of different things. One of the things that we would do in this case is we would actually go and modify the heightmap resolution. So we would change our target terrain data, heightmap resolution, ends up matching our heightmap width. Now, if we are doing an import where we're not doing a resize, and it just so happens that the texture matches exactly in terms of size, we could use this code path as well. And it's going to be a little bit better. We're not resampling the image. So it's a little bit faster. It's a little bit, it's going to be more accurate as well. So if we're matching, or if our heightmap width happens to equal our target terrain data, heightmap resolution. So two code paths there, or two sort of approaches there. One, if we're resizing, we obviously need to make the change. But if we're not resizing and it happens to match exactly, then we might as well use the code path that is going to be a little bit more accurate and also quite a bit faster. So, okay, what I need to do is firstly set up an array for holding the height data, which what I'm going to do is, that is our heights, that is a new float, and we use our heightmap width and heightmap height. We've already checked to make sure that those are the same, so that's okay. Then I can grab the pixel data from the image. So pixel data. So I can go, okay, well, heightmap. I can go get pixels. And I just retrieve the entire set. So, okay, we've gotten the full set of pixel data. Now we just need to transfer it. So what I can do is reloop y is less than our heightmap height. And we do the same for in x. Good. Now I need to be able to index these differently. So heights is straightforward for accessing because heights is going to be, we can just go x and y. But I need to know which one of the pixels to be accessing. So what I can do is my pixel index, I can calculate it. It's going to be x plus y multiplied by our heightmap.width. So this will give us our index into that pixel data. So then I can go pixel data, pixel index, and now that image could be all different colors. We really want it to be grayscale. I can actually just go pixel data.grayscale, and then we multiply that by our intensity. So we're transferring the pixel data into our height map here. And then all we do down here is we can go target terrain data, set heights. The basin is 0, and then we provide it heights. So that will correctly go and apply the color data there. So it transfers the color data into the height map and then updates our terrain. And this is fine for it to be going and setting it. We could go and actually a little bit of a step further and make it just in case that property is doing anything. So I could go and check if that is not equal to heightmap.width, just so it's only changing it where it absolutely needs to. Because heightmap resolution is a property, so there is likely additional stuff that is happening when we go and set it. So we can just minimize the number of sets that we need to do. So, okay, this is the code path where it's a direct transfer. Otherwise, we're needing to do a resampling, essentially. So we can't just go and grab the pixel data like that. We need to go and actually set this up a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do first is I'm still going to create our heights array. The difference with that is that our heights array, I'm going to store it separately here. So heightmap resolution. And the reason I'm pulling out the data like that is just because it makes the code a little bit cleaner and neater. So it just makes it that little bit briefer with the amount of code we need to write. So, okay, good so far. The actual setting of the heights will be exactly the same. So that part's the same. We still have our for loop here. The difference is that rather than looping over the texture, we're looping up to the heightmap resolution, and we'll do the same in X. X is less than our heightmap resolution. So a lot of this is the same. We'll still end up with a line here where it's heights, X, Y. We grab the pixel somehow, and we multiply it by intensity. But it's that grabbing of the pixel that is actually the key thing. So our height map, if we take a look at our options for get, one of the ones that we have is this get pixel by linear. And that allows us to provide a UV coordinate. So a UV coordinate is normalized, which this gives us a way to resample the image. So what I would have is, this is going to be a color. It's going to look like that. We have pixel grayscale multiplied by intensity. So to calculate these U and V coordinates, well, for getting our V coordinate, so our height map V, we can take our Y value, and I'm going to, just to make sure that this happens as a floating point calculation, cast it to a float, and then we divide that. And again, although it's not strictly necessary, tend to do it just to make sure that it's very clear what's happening. So that'll give us our height map V. And we can do the same thing for getting our height map U. And then what we have here is height map U, height map V, like that. So we resample the image, and then we transfer that over to the heights. So we're ready to test this out and see what happens. So we've set to fit the image to the terrain height map. So let's import it, and we should in particular be able to tell if it's working by, we'll see changes if we adjust the intensity there. So let's import it. So I don't really see anything with that, but if I change the intensity, we can see it's correctly importing that and applying that image, which that's really good. If I take a look at our terrain and look at its current settings, so the height map resolution currently for the terrain is that 513 by 513. If I change that, so let's go to our 1025 by 1025 and check that it still works. And we can see it still works. It's doing a little bit of resampling, which that's what we would expect. This is now using that one where it's doing the get pixel by linear. We do get a little bit of a weird sort of edge there. So we can see we do get some artifacts on the edge here when we're doing the importing and it's having to resample. So what we actually need to do is a couple of things. One of the things is these UV coordinates. We actually should be doing a -1 there, so the coordinates fully go that entire range of 0 to 1. The other thing that we need to be doing is our height map, when we actually import that texture, we want to change the wrap mode for it. So what I would actually be doing here is this selected image and its wrap mode. I'm going to go for texture mode clamp, so it doesn't actually try, and if we're sampling near the edges, end up wrapping around. So that's good. Now this won't automatically refresh, so I'm going to close that and bring this up. So we have to go and reselect the terrain, reselect the image. But what I will now find when I import this is I don't get those weird little artifacts, so that's good. So, okay, what about having it resize the actual terrain? Because that's something where we can see that it's currently using 1025 by 1025. Well, one of the things here is there's actually only very limited resolutions that it allows. So we want to actually check the resolution to make sure it's valid before we allow any importing there. So I'm going to set up here just a set of valid height map resolutions. And that's a new int. So our particular ones are 33, 65. So all of these are powers of 2 plus 1. Just got all of them. So that gives us a set of valid ones. So I want to actually check if our height map is within that range. So we can do this similar to what we did here is, okay, well, I want to check if it's actually present within that. And in particular, what I'm going to do is f system array exists. And what I'm wanting to do is I'll give it the valid height map resolutions. We'll check each element and see if the element is equal to selected image width. So if it is not, so if it's not a valid one, then I need to check the import mode as well. So if the import mode is equal to the resize, so it's fine if it's not the resize one, it's only if it's trying to resize the terrain that it's, we want to make sure that it has to be a valid one. So in this case, I want to do similar to what I did here, where we display an error and return the image resolution must be in valid range. So we can list all of the particular ones. What I would do to make it a little bit more maintainable is I would actually put that into a string. The other thing I need to do is this actually needs to go down here. And we can exit at this point. So are we trying to import an invalid image? So this way, it's going to do that check. Now it'll only do that check if we have this set to resize. So at the moment, it's 513, which is a valid one. If I intentionally went and changed this to something that is wrong, or just removed 513, then what we should see is we no longer have the option to import it. So again, we're keeping it so that it's making sure we've got those safety checks before it happens. So it's good. We've applied the safety check. We should now be able to safely switch this to the resize mode, which it is, and we can now do an import, and we should see our terrain the height map resolution here change. Now, one of the things we'll notice when we go and do the importing and I reset things back is if we watch the terrain width and the terrain length here, when I go and do the import, the resolution changes and then these actually shrink and they change relative to what the new height map resolution is. And that's something we don't want to have happen. So we want to actually make sure we preserve that width and height when we go and do changes like of this. So what I'm going to do, so here, what we can do is we can just grab a copy here of a target terrain and the size. So this is a vector 3, current size, like that. And then after we've gone and changed the resolution there, just go target terrain, terrain data.size, and we just make sure it's set back to the current one. So now when we go and do the import, what we're hoping to see is that this size doesn't actually change. So we want to make sure that we are switching from a different height map resolution, which we are. So now we can go and do import, and we see nothing really changes. Size here changes, but these sizes remain the same, which is good. So far so good. We've got our ability to import a height map, and we can actually change the intensity of it, things like of that. What would be handy is to also add in a export option as well, because we've got our import tools here, but we don't have our export tools. So what I'm going to do is set that up. And the other thing that we can do is we're not actually checking for this import expanded. So I'm going to do that here, like this. And all of this stuff goes into that. So all of this is in here. So that's all of our import tools. That'll make it easy for us to be able to collapse this. So we can go and say like that, which is good. And then we can set up another set of things where we do a similar approach, except this is going to be our export tools. So height map tool, export expanded. And again, it can be expanded by default. I'm going to bring all of this down here, just makes it easier. And that function's almost getting to the point where I would look at actually going and collapsing it. This is export. Export height map. Now, exporting is pretty simple, but is a handy one just for us to actually have supported there for this. So we'd have a GUI layout button, export height map. Now, we do want to make sure that this is only happening if we have a selected terrain, but we've already done that check up here. So that's good. So we can now set up here. What it will do is we'll have export height map, and we provide it our selected terrain. Again, following that same approach of making it so that we've got the variables there being passed in as parameters, just to make it easier for us refactoring later if we need to. So terrain, target terrain. Now what we need to do is kind of the reverse of this setup. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to grab all of this as a starting point. Because the heights, well, what I would do is I would do target terrain, terrain data, get heights, and I need to give it the range which can grab our heightmap resolution like this. So that's straightforward. The pixels, well, that's going to be new color, and we can do heightmap resolution by heightmap resolution like that. We're looping over this, and rather than going and grabbing from the pixel data to this, we're actually doing the opposite. So what we'd be doing is our height, which we know is going to be a 0 to 1 value. So we can then go, well, pixel data, pixel index is a new color, and we can just provide it with our height like that. In all of the values, that'll make it grayscale. Then to actually set the image data, well, that's reasonably straightforward. We can just go and create a new texture. So what I'll do is have a texture 2D. Height map is a new texture 2D. Well, we know the resolution. And format-wise, we're providing this, I would say, texture format. We're doing RGB24. And there is no MIP chain. So we're not needing to generate any MIP maps for that. That would be a little bit of overkill for it. We can go heightmap set pixels, and we can give it the pixel data. Then to actually save it is pretty straightforward. I can store this string save file path. So similar thing with the editor. In this case, it's editor utility save file panel. So we would go save heightmap as. We can give it by default our path. I'm going to give it a default name. So call that terrain heightmap.png. And the extension is PNG. I would use PNG as the default for this. I wouldn't use something like JPEG. We don't want compression for it. So if the save file path length is greater than 0, so if it was valid, then we can just do a system.io file, write all bytes. We give it the path, and then we say our heightmap encode to PNG. That's all we need to do for doing the export function. And we can test that that works. So we've got our export option, so we can go export heightmap. That's exported into the main folder there. Now if I select the heightmap and I select that one and do an import, and we can go for fit image, nothing changes, which is exactly what should happen. If I import it at a different scale, it does change, but import it at the full scale, nothing changes because we've created an exact copy of it, which is excellent. So the final thing we want to do is just a little bit of improvements for our setup here. And one of the things we want to do is when we go and show the window, I want to just be able to go window reset. And when it gets destroyed, I want to make sure we reset everything as well. And our reset function, well, what that needs to do is we've got a lot of data that we're keeping track of here. So I just want to go and make sure that these all get properly reset back to their default values. Just so that we're keeping everything nice and cleaned up. So import mode, so if we close it, everything gets reset back. Good. So what that should mean is if we go and close this, and then we'll go and reopen it, everything is nicely reset. We can select our terrain again. We can select our image. So all of that looks good. We can do an import. Again, nothing changes. Change the scale. So that's good. We've created a little helper that's able to import our height maps, and we can import from a variety of image formats because the default terrain only supports the raw format, which can be a bit of a pain to work with. We also have control over what happens with that importing. We're able to resample the image, we're able to resize the terrain. We could be doing other operations there as well. So if you wanted to have this go and just randomize the terrain, we could be doing that. If we wanted to have it that it imports the image and applies it at a particular intensity, so it modifies what's already there, we could quite easily modify what we've got there to do that. And we can easily then export our terrain images so that we can then reuse that in other areas. So if there's additional things that you would like to see added to this, chuck those in a comment below, because there's a lot of different things that I could be adding to this. And what I'd like to do is add things to it that are going to be particularly useful to folks. So if there's stuff you can think of that you would like to see added, just throw that in a comment, and then there's going to be a subsequent part where I'll be adding those things into it. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe, it really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you have any questions, chuck in a comment below. If you're looking for the code for the project, that code is available up on GitHub. There is a link to that in the description, and as with all of the projects, you can use this code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. There's no restrictions or anything like that there. If you are looking for trying to find a video on a particular topic, then I do have a searchable video archive, which there is a link to that in the description as well. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description also. But until next time, bye.